Welcome to my presentation about the inspection of cooperatives for inclusive education in the Netherlands. It's a study I did with my colleagues Pim Hydra and Nathalie Maassen. The content of this presentation is about special needs education in the Netherlands, about its development over the past decades, then about the introduction of the Inclusive Education Act, which introduced regional cooperatives. I will tell you about that. And then I will tell you how we did a study on the inspections of these cooperatives. So a study of not inspections of single schools, but inspections of cooperatives. Then I will present the main findings and I will end with a conclusion. Special needs education in the Netherlands has developed over the years and basically has grown in size a lot. Since the 1950s, first we saw an increased separation of children with special needs in special institutions, so being educated away from the mainstream of education. And in the 1990s, internationally, this was considered a very poor move, something we really didn't want. We didn't want more and more children being educated outside our regular education stream. And to change that, in 2000, the Netherlands introduced a vouchers system, which allowed students to have support in regular schools, within regular schools, for their special needs. The only problem in the Netherlands was that this new type of voucher system with students educated in regular schools didn't really stop the separation of special needs education and special institutions, but it increased enormously the number of children that were labeled as diagnosed as having some kind of disorder in regular schools. And it did it so much that, for instance, in the Netherlands, some schools now have 20% of their pupils officially suffering from dyslexia, which is internationally seen as ridiculous. And not only is that quite bad for the students, they are stigmatized, sometimes medicalized, but it's also quite bad for the government in terms of costs. The system as a whole was becoming increasingly expensive. Now, the government thought about possible causes for this rise in use of especially the voucher system, but also the increased separation of students, and they came up with several causes. I've listed 4 below. And the basic idea is that it was not so much the real underlying problematic in the population that was leading to these increases of pupils having vouchers and being separated. It was basically the perverse incentives that were provided by the policies. Every child which could be diagnosed, labeled with some kind of disorder, would lead to more money for the schools or for easier solutions for the schools in terms of separating children. In order to curb that trend, the Dutch government introduced new legislation in 2014, and that legislation was the Inclusive Education Act. And the Inclusive Education Act did a number of things, but the most important one was that it introduced the concept of cooperatives, samenwerkingsverbanden, in the Netherlands. And a cooperative then would consist of all the schools in a region, certain territory, and all those schools would have to work together with the Inclusive Education Act, and they would be responsible for providing children with appropriate education, proper education at their level, with proper support structures, and they were having to organize that first of all by providing a regional support structure which would be suited to all kinds of special needs, so that every child in a region could find a place in education in their own region. Second thing to give them proper support would be that all the schools in that region would have to improve their special needs support for their pupils. And the third thing was that the regions would be responsible for improving information and also improving placement of pupils with special needs in schools, so that the parents themselves wouldn't be forced to go along several schools to find a place for their parents and for their pupils, and perhaps never finding a place. Another smart thing, apart from these cooperatives, was that the Dutch government decided to define fixed budgets per region, depending on the number of children in that region, and that these budgets were fixed in the sense that if a region spent more on special education than the budget that was available, then they wouldn't get paid anymore over that budget, and if they spent less, they would be allowed to keep the rest. The third element, you could say, in the sort of last point, was that in the Inclusive Education Act, it was decided that there would be inspections at the level of the cooperatives. So not only the schools were inspected, which they were from a long time ago, but they also had now inspections at the level of the cooperatives. So the schools working together in the cooperatives had inspections at the level of that cooperative. Here, a brief picture of how the Netherlands has been divided up in a number of cooperatives. These are the 77 cooperatives of primary education. So you can see that there are basically large areas where there's one cooperative. In this case, I think it was 50,000 pupils in that cooperative who are educated, and perhaps 200 schools. And here, a much smaller one with, I think, 5,000 pupils. Our study was on how the cooperatives are inspected and what the impacts are of these inspections. And we used three methods, basically. We did a single case study of one cooperative and one inspection of that cooperative in 2016. We did an analysis of inspection reports in 2017 to look at the results of 25 inspections. And we did a survey among all the 152 managing directors of all the cooperatives, and to find out how they had experienced the inspection and the impact of the inspection. Basically, our first findings were that the whole idea of the Inclusive Education Act, that you will try to get more children included in regular schools, is not contradicted. Basically, everybody agrees that what was going on in the Netherlands was somewhat strange. The second thing is that the schools share a responsibility here is also, I think, accepted by most actors in those networks. And the third thing, quite surprisingly, is that actually there's quite some agreement that if you want to achieve this, then that you will need to have network level inspection. So in that sense, the new legislation was a good idea. But if you look further, you saw, and we saw that in the case studies, but also elsewhere, you see that there are a lot of tensions coming out of that Inclusive Education Act and out of these cooperatives. And basically, two tensions are very strong. It's the tension between the schools themselves and the networks they've created. It's an old kind of tension that in the Netherlands we have public schools, but also confessional Catholic schools, confessional Protestant schools, and quite some other types of schools as well. And there's always a tension between them, and that didn't go away because they were now in a cooperative. So you had a cooperative in which there were already tensions between existing networks. The second thing was that a new tension arose now between the cooperatives as a new kind of network and existing local networks. And these tensions were especially about worries that the cooperatives as a new level would demand increasing bureaucracy. All kinds of new forms to be filled in, all kinds of data to be collected, and so there were worries about that at the level of local communities especially. The second worry was about loss of autonomy and loss of local knowledge and respect for local achievements. So you had these existing networks of schools, some of which were really active already, and they had done all kinds of marvelous things to come to special needs education, and now suddenly they were in a cooperative, and that cooperative took the lead in almost everything. And the local networks, they weren't allowed their own policy anymore. They had to do basically what the cooperative decided, and there was some worries, if not to say anger about that. And lastly, the finding was that where the cooperatives are called cooperatives, which suggests cooperation, in the case study and also in the survey, we found that there were quite some cooperatives where the actual cooperation was really limited. You could really ask, are they working together at the level of the cooperative as a whole with all schools that are in there, or are they just, well, basically continuing on the same foot that they did always with their own local networks? Then we looked at the inspectorate's approach. How did the inspectorate conduct the inspections? And we saw that the inspectorate actually was doing things which could take away a lot of those worries. The inspectorate was changing to a new kind of inspection system, a new inspection approach called 2020. And the idea was the inspection should be more supportive, more facilitative to learning, and you could really see that they were trying to do that. And what we saw was that they even had compiled a list of criteria which could be used in the inspections of the cooperatives, but they decided it was too early and they didn't apply that. They decided, well, let's leave that and take a softer approach. And in that softer approach, they basically looked a lot at signs of good cooperation, and if that wasn't there, maybe positive intentions or ambitions, that would be a good sign that things were going the right way. They made often some remarks about data gathering and reporting and governance structures as well, but in the end, most reports were about being supportive of what the cooperatives had achieved, what they were doing, and it was always respected that this was a new task and it was difficult, and that the cooperatives were still starting, and so there were not very harsh words in most of the reports. How could we understand it? Well, in Dutch we have a saying that there can be two hands on one belly, and that basically means that if you have two hands on one belly, those hands are cozy there. They don't fight. They're just there and respect each other, support each other perhaps. And this is really what I thought of when I thought of what are the inspectorate and cooperatives now actually doing, and especially the inspectors and the management of the cooperatives. And my conclusion was that the inspectorates and the managers of the cooperatives are basically doing almost the same thing. They are sharing a responsibility in making inclusive education a success, and they're looking at the whole problem of making schools work together. They both recognize that if you pull too hard on that, then probably you will lose the schools, and they won't like the whole idea anymore. So you're really trying to carefully manage the schools to go the right way, and you try to convince them that it's a good idea. We have to work together, and we have to achieve this together. And so it's a kind of way of governing which Foucault has termed governmentality. You're entering the mind of the citizens, of the subjects, and convincing them that they have to do things rather than that you force them to do things. We could actually find proof of that, of the managers and the inspectorates being closely together. Often the managers called the inspectorate a critical friend. That was really said several times. And one manager of a cooperative actually said, well, I see the inspectorate as a means to exert pressure on the school boards. And that's remarkable, because actually the cooperative would be an organization by the school boards, and then so the managing director would be expected to work in the interest of the school boards, and not say, well, I work for the inspection, and I try to pressure my own school boards. But it gives you an idea that they're looking at this, solving the same kind of problems in the same kind of ways. Conclusion. If you talk about impact, does this inspection of cooperatives work in the Netherlands? Well, that's very hard to establish directly, because a lot of things are probably already happening under the influence of the law. The Inclusive Education Act will force schools and cooperatives to do certain things, and if this is asked in terms of the law, it doesn't really need inspections. Inspections can push it a little bit and saying, well, you really need to have to update your website, but that's not about the core issues of corporations and working together in a region. If you look at that issue, then there is probably only limited direct impact of inspections, at least at the moment. What we saw and what I explained is we have the inspectorate walking on eggshells here, not trying to pull too hard to keep the string from breaking. And you even have the managing directors of the cooperatives doing the same. And so both are afraid to bite. They certainly will not do things to antagonize the schools, but they are even afraid to say some things. Like the inspectorate could probably be more open now about regions where the whole idea is not taken up seriously and doesn't work, but the inspectorate doesn't say that too hard, because if they would say that, it would disturb the whole process. Is that a clear sign that it won't work in the end? Well, I'm not sure. In the long term, I think that the basic ideas which are in the Inclusive Education Act may be so convincing that schools will start to pick them up and will try to to work together more. So maybe if you really get into the minds of all those head teachers and so on and school boards, then maybe some change will come from this. But at the moment there are really critical issues on these cooperatives, and first of all, a critical issue is the size of the cooperatives. So I already said there are cooperatives where there are like 50,000 students. That's a really large cooperative, and like 200 schools or even more school boards. If you have that kind of size, it's really difficult to see that working. And if you have people living away 50 kilometers from each other, it's really difficult to expect them to really work together in such a cooperative. The second thing is that what we actually see is that schools limit their cooperation at the moment, and they actually employ ways in reducing cooperation to a more manageable level, and also reducing risk sharing. They simply say in some cooperatives, well, we have sub-regions, and then they work for a large part within those sub-regions and only do the most necessary things at the level of the cooperative. I don't think that's particularly bad. I think it's a good idea, but it kind of undermines the idea of these cooperatives working together. It especially undermines the whole idea of the Inclusive Education Act, where you see that they use school models, so-called school models, to divide monies among the schools, and where they actually bring back the risk factor of having too many special needs pupils in a school to the level of the school again, and that certainly would undermine the whole idea that you take responsibility at the network level. Another critical issue is that inclusive education will have important effect on the schools and on the workload in the schools. And one effect is certainly that the student population in schools is changing. Teachers have to deal with more children with special needs in those regular classes, and that of course increases the teaching load. And the other thing is that the Inclusive Education Act is likely to lead to more bureaucracy, and that there are already signs of that too. And a last point, which I think is really critical, is that with the Inclusive Education Act and the introduction of these cooperatives, we